Here we have our central grasslands. On the right, the dark green represents the tallgrass prairie, an area that indeed has enough precipitation to support trees, but it didn't. The midgrass prairie, shown in the light green, and finally the shortgrass prairie to the far left. There has been a dearth of studies in that green area, the tallgrass prairie. There are several studies documenting the occurrence of fire in the other two areas. I can think of 4 or 5. Just
Do you want to replace that?
okay.
Microphone?
Oh, this thing? Okay.
This one that's going out? Somebody just came and said your guys' microphone is going out.
Okay. My hearing is
No, that's okay.
like Henry's, not good. Thank you. Getting back to this. So, I picked out a 7-state study area, and I began to become a bibliophile as if I wasn't already. I started looking for the occurrence of fire in Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, and North Dakota. 7 states. Now you see some little dark areas there. Those actually show where fires occurred, not the number of fires. Well, something happened with that. Okay. I don't know what did. Oh, we're good. When things disappear, you know, you get to wondering at times. Why this study? Well, back when I started this, there were these people that saying, why are you burning? They had all sorts of reasons. Critics saying, there's smoke. But that wasn't all they said. Some of them said, I don't believe you. These prairies didn't burn, nor did these woodlands with their herbaceous understory. This is fictitious, this stuff that you're talking about. They also said that the indigenous Native Americans did not start fires. That was another fabrication that we were trying to put upon them. I love this one. The prairies were kept free of trees because bison came up and rubbed against them, effectively girdling them and killing a tree. Now the bisons did a lot of rubbing in those years. There are also those that said, look, I saw you burning and there were animals running out of there and they were on fire. Also, there were those that said there are insects in those prairies and when you burn, you kill them. They would come to the conferences and they would talk to people, get them off to the side, say, come here. Fire kills insects. Soon there will be no insects if these things continue. Now I had to have some sort of a system, some sort of a filter to determine what fires would be chosen and become a part of the database and what would not. Location was essential. There were all sorts of things in these immigrants' guides, in letters, county histories, and various things that say there was a fire, but it didn't say where, and it also didn't say when. So I liked the actual date, but having the season, spring, summer, fall, would work well too. Weather conditions, kind of a luxury, a nice bit of data to have. And the effects on vegetation, the size, some descriptions of the fires were very detailed, others just minimal information, so it varied quite a bit. But when you work at it, you eventually get some to eventually form sort of a database. Effects on wildlife. Believe it or not, bison did get burned in some of the fires, blinding them. And then, of course, the effects on people and their properties, that being one of the list ones. The total number of fires, 700, well over 700. And you notice of the three groups, only 32 from that 7-state study area for Native Americans. 194 Europeans over that 7-state area from that 200 plus years, 1673 to about 1905. 569 from a 10-year period in Minnesota. Now, about those 32, you know, there were those people that were saying Native Americans didn't burn, don't tell me that. Well, they used fire for hunting, and they did indeed have a pretty organized system of conducting those hunts, forming ring fires, not just for bison, but also for deer. And some of the reviewers of the paper said, why, that's a big number, 32? And I said, well, not really. When you're talking about 235 years and 7 states, that's not a big number. When you look at the Western studies, they had way over 100, each of them. And they had them specifically assigned to location, to tribe, and quite detailed. It was not always possible to do that here. So why is the number so small? I'd like to point out a few dates to you. 1640, 1673, and 1680. And you might say, what the heck does that mean? It's a good question. The upper right, that red area or lavender area, is where the Iroquois lived. In 1640, a series of wars began, and it had a rather interesting name. They called them the Beaver Wars. Beavers, you say. Beavers were becoming quite scarce. The fur trade was in full bloom. And the Iroquois were shooting beavers and trading them there in New York for things like metal knives, guns, metal pots, and so on. But when the beavers were gone, the Iroquois started looking elsewhere in those states, right there, and they went to all of them. 1680, you see, right there for Illinois, 1680 for Indiana, and so on. Well, in 1680, 1673 to 1680 were some of the first reports of fire from Illinois. The French explorers, Hennepin, LaSalle, would describe fires on the prairie. And by 1680, though, things began to change a little bit. That was the year LaSalle said this. He was unable to imagine what had prevented the Illinois from setting fires to the prairies, as was their custom when hunting the wild cattle. What was going on? Well, we sat here at Starved Rock State Park. It was the site of the grand village of the Kaskaskia, one of the bands of the Illinois Confederacy. What happened in 1680 was this. The 1st of December, according to LaSalle, we arrived at the Kaskaskia village here, where we found nothing but the remains from the fire and the rage of the Iroquois. All was in ruins, and there remained only some ends of burned poles, which marked what had been the extent of the village, and on the greater part of which were fixed the heads of the dead persons eaten by crows. Would you start a fire when the Iroquois was around? You might end up like these. I propose to you that that was one of the reasons why fires started to diminish among the indigenous people. But there were other reasons. This shows in red the attacks of the Iroquois. In the green, forced movements westward by Algonquin-speaking tribes. And then in the tan, forced movement of the Iroquoian-speaking people. They were being pushed westward, again, being relocated, pushed, attacked. Would you start a fire? There was this tribe called the Tamaroras, another bunch of the Illinois Confederacy. The Iroquois chased them, sort of hopscotching up and along the Illinois River until they got to the end of Calhoun County, Illinois, at a place known as Deer Plain. Now the Tamaroras, being somewhat trustful, camped overnight. The Iroquois took after them and slaughtered 700, and that was the end of the Tamaroras. Now, let's take these lines and say that these are diseases. The red being smallpox. If it didn't kill them, they were so severely scarred that many committed suicide. Take the green, Let's say that is measles. And then the tan, influenza. In the eastern part, in Massachusetts, there was this group of people known as the Wampanoag. From 1616 to 1619, 90% of them died. And that disease spread westward. The Illinois Confederacy, which in 1673 numbered around 10,000, was reduced to only 300 in the year 1842 when they were forced out of the state. Now, the French, at first, the Indians got along with them fairly well. They hunted and trapped. They lived with the Indians, and things were okay. But then other Europeans came along and they wanted land. The surveyors came, those land lookers, with their instruments that were stealing the land. And they resented that and fought against it. But we had two completely different manners of living. The indigenous people that were somewhat nomadic, that were used to fire on the landscape, that were accustomed to the grasslands. The Europeans, which were sedentary with their houses, their fences, they were not accustomed to fire, and they were primarily people of the forests. When they first settled, they settled in prairie groves, somewhere within the forest communities. And again, another slide showing location of fires, but this. Wind direction. There were about 60, I don't remember the exact number, that gave wind direction. And you see wind direction is primarily from the west, southwest, and south. Almost every one of the fires that I found where they gave wind direction, they described it as raging, powerful, furious, gale, terrific, or something like that. Rarely there would be a fire from the east. Those two that were in the northern part of Illinois. The fires were quite extensive, burning over, now I've got that in hectares. Just say that's around 60,000 acres for that Ohio prairie. And southern Illinois on fire south of what is now I-74 in the fall of 1819. And this one burned for 160 kilometers, 1.6 miles. 1 mile is 1.6 kilometers, and huge fires there. But the speed at which some of those fires burned. One started, for example, at 10 o'clock in the morning at Stark County, just north of Peoria, here in Illinois. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it was at Rockford. So in 6 hours, driven by a strong south wind. Fires were more extensive in drought years. 1796, much of Ohio was on fire. 1819, there were literally fires everywhere, if you want to use that term. Western Iowa, Maryland, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Then in 1871, everyone is familiar with the Chicago fire, but this Peshtigo fire was the worst, killing large numbers of people, driven by strong winds. There was a weather person, believe it or not, in Chicago that described the fires in that year as strong enough to cause a strong person to be knocked to the ground. In Piatt County, there was this lady called Grandma Jane Patton, and she said 1871 was the driest time I ever saw. So in those drought years, the marshes would dry, the peat would catch on fire, and they would burn and keep burning. The snows would come and they kept burning, and the steam would be rising out from the ground like some sort of a geyser. That happened in many parts of Illinois, converting those marshes into ponds and into lakes. And in other places, completely flattening large expanses of woodland. I mentioned seasons. And you see that in those 194 fires, primarily in the fall. Now, grasslands throughout the entire world have one thing in common. I said earlier that they existed under a variety of soils and climates, but they all have a season during which the vegetation becomes dry, flammable, ready to burn. Fire. That was what Carl Sauer said many years ago. Here in Illinois, although it's not seemingly so prominent anymore, that time was called Indian summer. And that vegetation, according to some, would become so dry and so flammable that it was surpassed only by gunpowder and kerosene. So, that Indian summer or second summer in the meteorological literature is called a singularity. That means it's something that happens about every year, but no one knows why. It's sort of an unexplained event, like, say, the January thaw would be another one. Now, the Minnesota fires. And again, you see high incidence in those fall months. Later on, the fires, the cause of the fires would start to change. For many of those that you saw, those 194, it was very difficult to pinpoint a reason, the cause of the fire. There were always those who would say it was those hunters. They were driving game. But yet, finding that document that would conclusively prove that was difficult to do. And so most of them ended up unexplained. But then the railroads came about 1850 in Illinois, and later or earlier in other states, and things began to change. They initially burned wood, but eventually switched to coal. And of course, those old steam engines puffed out sparks. And those sparks would hit that dry grass, and then the fires would start and would sometimes burn for a long time. Then there were threshing machines. It's a stationary steam engine, in this case, or steam tractor, but again, sparks and fire. And they had a lot of dry straw right there. And it caught on fire and burned up these tractors, but started a lot of fires. And so this is Minnesota data from that 10-year period. Locomotives, burning stubble, fire breaks, threshing engines, others, and again, those that are unexplained or unknown. Now, burning stubble was a common practice extending back prior to 1850. And in fact, in 1842, there was this girl, Sarah, who described her dad going out, and she wrote, "Papa burned off the field this morning, for it is better to do that before plowing." Well, yeah, having all that thatch on is difficult. So it was accustomed to burn it off. And sometimes they would pick a day when the wind wasn't exactly in their favor and the fire would get away. And some of those unexplained ones there are likely some of those. And others, you can guess, were arson. There are likely people that just simply thought it would be nice to see it burn. Now, initially, prairie fires were fascinating to the European settlers, just as prairies were when they were in bloom, fascinated by the flowers. But that would change. This shows a curve corresponding to immigration, where the number of fires, here we're beginning just the late 18 or 1700s, showing how fires increased and kind of followed different curves there, waves, if you wish. There have been some studies on this in detail using tree ring research. Now, the effects on vegetation. Already talked about that, but the smoke produced by the fires was just absolutely unbelievable. Smoke during that Indian summer weather for days, for weeks. And this is what John James Audubon had to say about it. The Indian summer, this extraordinary phenomenon of North America, is now in its splendor. The blood-rising sun and a constant smoky atmosphere. This is John James Audubon, the 20th of November, 1820, in Henderson County, Kentucky. So, the fires were raging across those grasslands. People were afraid. They began to literally hate the prairie, hate the fires. and they slept, as the expression goes, with one eye open, watching at night for fires coming and trying to be ready to fight them. All sorts of names were given to them. The messenger of death, the great destroyer, train of desolation, and the demon of the prairie. And if you look at some of the early literature on fire suppression, there he is, portraying fire as the devil. And orange demons grow near. Nothing can stop their path. Flames billowing like waves as they feed on dry grass. And when the pioneers saw this, they panicked. Call the neighbor, run, get your stuff ready. It's coming. We must fight. Tappalet. And so today, what is this fire like on the prairies? What they used to be like? I say like a blast furnace, roaring through the woods, roaring through the prairies. Nothing could stop them. And fighting the fire with brush, with wet gunny sacks, clashing with the enemy. Fiercely did they fight, stomping burning embers, sweeping left and right. And they began legislation to control and reduce the fires. 1794, 1799, and all states would eventually enact them. Then Minnesota hired a chief fire warden in 1895, and townships had their own. And that quickly resulted, as you see, in the early mid-1890s, an eventual reduction in the number of fires, trying to contain them. It also meant trying to reduce the fires by overgrazing, seeding, plowing, and woody invasion. In the absence of fire, prairies changed to woodlands. Woodlands changed to forest, and the complete loss of grassland communities. I remember going to look for this prairie in Hancock County. It was on the natural areas inventory, and had a television antenna in the middle of it. No one could find the prairie anymore. I went there and I found one plant of side oats grama. Now, where are those insects today? And I would also ask you this. Whoops, that did it. Those animals that live in the prairies, where are they? And I would encourage you to do this. You'll unite. You've already talked about that. There will always be people that have funnel vision. That's an expression my dad used. Now, by funnel, not tunnel, but funnel. They see their own idea of what should happen, and that's it, to the exclusion of everything else. And so we will continue to be working and trying to get fire on the landscape from now on. But progress is made little by little. I started this study 40 years ago. I've become gray-headed since. And one last thing, I mentioned the Wampanoags. They were without a language for 150 years. But they now have children speaking it. They have brought their language back, which is remarkable because of books and other things are written in their language. We can bring the grasslands back in the same way. It can be done. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I hope I didn't run over too much.
No, I don't think you went over at all. If we have time for a couple of questions, anybody have a question? I'll bring the question to you, Susan.
Hello, I was wondering if you thought that the enormously large fires that happened after Europeans started settling here and the Native Americans left was perhaps because the Native Americans weren't doing small fires, so the fires that did happen were enormous. Like you said, they go for hundreds of miles and things like that. Is it because the fuel load was just so great? Because there was this in-between time where we hadn't plowed at all, but the Native Americans had left and they weren't burning, and so the fires were outrageously large and crazy. I just wondered if you thought that's maybe why.
Okay, I'm not, now, like I said, I'm like Henry, my hearing's not so good.
All right, so I think I'll help you. Susan asked, do you think that the fires were so large after settlement, after European settlement, because the natives had left for a while and there was a lot of fuel load build up?
Oh.
Can you say something about that?
Oh, yeah, you're saying that,
Step up to
yeah, the fuel. The Native Americans left Illinois in 1832 and later in other states. There may have been an accumulation of fuel. Now, burning didn't stop everywhere. There were still localized areas of burning. But maybe. But those large unbroken expanses allowed for the movement of the fire, and depending upon weather and a lot of other things, and wind velocity would be behind creating those infernos that I now call nature's blast furnace. That's what those things really were. So it's a possibility, but I'm not sure that I can give you a real good answer other than that.
All right, is there another question out there? Bill? Outstanding. Well, thank you so much, Bill. That was really great.
You're welcome. Have a great day.